Now to have that conversation and hopefully look at whether there are some solutions that we can look at. Joining me in studio is Jacqueline McGlade, who's the Director of Science at the UN Environment. Good morning and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, good morning.
Now, looking at just that story by one of our reporters, Timothy Atieno, very sorry state, but there seems to be a perennial drought that doesn't seem to end. Is that something that we can quantify scientifically?
Absolutely. Since about 2011, we've seen just a continuation of the drought, intensifying, particularly in the Horn of Africa. And right now, as you have reported, we have 9 countries where nearly 17 million people exposed to drought are actually facing hunger and famine. So the scientific story is very clear. The intensification, the deepening of the problem means that we're going to have droughts for years to come. And with that knowledge and knowing about El Nino, it actually makes us really sit back and think, well, we have to do something more systematic. We can't just simply respond all the time to crises.
And looking at this situation, it's not really got us by surprise, or it has not got Somalia by surprise. Or would it be a result of possibly being so embroiled in war for a long time that you cannot concentrate on some of the things that would maybe mitigate a drought like this?
Well, this is the sad thing. We actually see signals coming from the environment that means we could have anticipated many of the people who are now displaced being just unable to live where they are because of the lack of food and water, the crop failures that really make people get on the move to go to other places. And I think this is where the science can already help, because we need to give people alternatives.
Okay.
We need to really respond, and the science is there to do that. Some of the stories we can see about new crops, drought resistance, making them affordable, helping people to stay where they are. Yes, conflicts do happen, but actually a lot of it happens because people move away from their natural territories.
All right, now looking at Somalia as a case in point and an example, do you think the situation is so dire and so desperate because war has kept them basically concentrating on the war, as opposed to now maybe interventions like you're saying, where you have crops that can maybe more resistant?
I think the challenge is that our eyes are distracted away from the humanitarian crisis, and then how do people just get beyond today? If there was sufficient health care to get people on their feet and going again, actually we could create small projects, which means they would feed themselves locally, maybe not having to go back to their homes to begin with. So yes, conflict will always be a distraction. It's a terrible distraction, but we can help people living where they are in the camps to create the possibility of small livelihoods, which they can take with them when eventually they will return.
Okay, we'll come to the solutions possibly from your studies for Somalia, but is this uniquely a Somalia problem when it comes to drought, or is it global?
No, it's a global problem. We have droughts in South America, in Brazil, we have droughts in the north. We even have droughts actually in Europe, but we mitigate because you put water through technology and make it available. What we lack here is infrastructure. So it hits people in 2 ways, but the droughts are worldwide.
Okay. Now, what's the UN doing possibly in the Horn of Africa to address this? And of course, we do know that the most affected normally are women and children.
The most vulnerable, yes, are women and children, and also elderly, because they can't move so easily. What we're trying to do through our poverty and environment initiatives is really focus on those groups, making sure that they can even create an opportunity to have food every day, to make sure there's clean water. And clean water really is one of the keys, because without it, you end up with cholera, with diarrhea, with all these other problems that in the end kill many people. These are not really fatal diseases unless they get to the point where you really are beyond with malnutrition. So our projects are aimed very much at focusing on small groups that have got resilience, where they can respond to small amounts of effort to lift themselves out of the problem and actually respond to the environment around them, grow some food, actually start to build a little bit more of a livelihood.
Okay, now that is the UN intervention. How important is the local government and the local organization of each country in terms of having this mitigated? Because UN can only do so much.
We are always reliant upon local authorities, local governments and communities. And so I think entering at all 3 levels is essential. And the UN itself is empowered really through the national government. So we need everything to work. We need the national level to talk to locals, to enable us to actually be there on the ground.
Now, looking at the Horn of Africa, maybe possible solutions that the UN has come up with that can intervene?
I think in the Horn of Africa, desertification and the loss of viable farmland is really crucial. So where we can help is to create women's groups, livelihoods that really bring other kinds of opportunities, not just farming, but pastoralism where we've got better crops, more diversity, which are drought resistant, because that's the reality. Not everyone should be moving to cities. We really need to keep people in the land and make that land fertile. So we have projects that enable small amounts of water to be able to create productive land. And that's almost the key to keeping families together, providing food and helping to create some money in the families.
I'm sure ownership of projects like this and ideas like this is absolutely crucial. It cannot work unless there's that ownership. Your comments maybe from your experience as to how much ownership there is on the local, on the ground when it comes to owning up projects like this.
My own experience in Africa here, also in Kenya, is that when people own it, it will be successful.
It will work.
People will put their own efforts in. They'll even sell their livestock to make something work. And really, in the balance between keeping a cow alive in a very poor condition and getting rid of it in a way is sometimes a relief to many of the families. So we need to look in the long term, and that's why local ownership, changing their view that the world will change, it's not going to be the same, and bringing resilience from the local communities, the knowledge that they have, is really where the UN can help.
Okay. Now, using the example you've just used, and you'll find in some parts of Africa, there's a certain cultural attachment to livestock and animals and even areas. How difficult is it for the UN to sell this kind of idea? Because you may actually be treading on cultural, historical cultural backgrounds that possibly asking people to think differently.
Yes, as the Director of Science, I would say that you can't do this through logic. You have to do it through emotion, through cultural really a recognition of how people have traditionally lived. In my own experience, in a Maasai village where I live, we've had that conversation, and we have agreed that we cannot sustain the number of livestock, but it was a group decision brought about both by science and knowledge of what the future holds, and understanding that there's no point in having all your wealth in livestock if they're just going to die in the face of drought.
Do you think information has played a big role in now that particular example you've given for them to accept that?
Yes, information, a lot of discussion, and really understanding where people will find their futures. So having a smaller number of cattle is probably better than having half of them die each year in a drought. And that reality needs some facts before people will really face up to it.
Okay. Possibly your thoughts on global warming when it comes to this whole conversation?
Well, here's the devastating news. I think that global warming, for me as a scientist, is a given. It is an existential threat for many populations around the world, whether they're in the Arctic or even in the developed world. In America, there will be people who will have to move. And it will just continue year on year. Last year was a year of superlatives. It was the hottest year, the greatest sea level rise, most sea ice lost in the Arctic, and so on, the most number of droughts around the world. So we have to face facts that global warming will create a problem unless we're prepared to not just adapt technically, but we have to adapt our minds. We have to adapt how we think about ourselves, so that cognitive dissonance, the kind of what we see in the world and what we actually think we should see, will really have to take shape in a different form.
Now, talking about global warming, I've had scientists say that there's a certain number of degrees. If we go past that, there is no reversal. Is it too late? Do you think we can still reverse to some degree or to some extent?
Well, the key word is 2 degrees, and it's 2 degrees above an industrial long term. But yes, we're getting perilously close. Already we're 1.1 degrees centigrade on average, and 1.5 already tell us there will be catastrophic changes in different parts of the world. Is it too late? No, but we have to act now. The urgency is upon us. And what does it require? Well, it requires investment in alternative energy. That is the source of the issue. If we remove fossil fuels, carbon dioxide, the gases that go into the atmosphere, we will fundamentally give ourselves the chance to breathe and to actually build a new future. If we do not act in the next 5 years, then we can definitely say we will have to really develop new technologies which are unheard of and unknown.
And right now, is there any hope of those technologies being developed, or should we be looking at reversing or at least mitigating and doing something about it?
We need everything. We need all the sort of negative technologies, as we call them, but we also need people to change in a way which means they're more resilient to the hits that nature will bring us.
Thank you very much. And that's Jacqueline McGlade, Director of Science and at the UN Environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Now we move on to other stories.